Okay, this is being recorded. I'll see if the live stream to YouTube will connect. We have 6 attendees so far. Welcome. Okay, YouTube Live is on. Attendees are still coming in. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. Okay. So one more minute, we'll get started at 12:05. So far, we've got our 12 attendees. Thank you for joining, everyone. Friendly reminder that this meeting is being recorded. And let me share one slide. Okay, so a reminder, just in case every once in a while we get a bad apple, but please be respectful. Mute your audio when you're not speaking. Raise your hand if you have a verbal question you'd like to ask when we get to the question and answer period. And thank you for coming. Again, this meeting is being recorded. We will post it to our website in the next few days. And if you would like your own copy of the PowerPoint slides, you can go to vta.org/budget, and you will see the slides there right now. So I'm going to stop sharing that one, and we'll go to the presentation. And Kathleen Kelly's our interim Chief Financial Officer, Kathleen, take it away.
Thank you. We did a similar presentation to our board on last Friday, and it took us about a half an hour to go through the presentation. But today, thankfully, we are going to move much faster, and then we'd be happy to come back to questions in areas where people have those. So we'll go through this probably in about 15 minutes. Let's go to the first slide, please. The VTA is actually more than just a transit operator, and we have a number of different roles and different budgets. You can see here we have 8 different independent funds that are included in the budget. I'm going to go through the first one, which is the VTA Transit Fund. There's both an operating and a capital component, and I'm going to talk about the operating side. That's where all of the bus and rail operations and maintenance programs are funded. Below that, you see a list of the other funds. Many of them have both a capital and an operating component. Franklin is going to go through the rest of the presentation. Next slide, please. The next slide after this. This picture here, it just kind of summarizes where we always are with budgets. We have lots of things that we want to do, and we have a limited amount of money. The other way to say that is that we can do just about anything we want, but we certainly cannot do everything that we want to do. So a budget is where you set the priorities for what we're going to be doing for the next year. Let's go on to the next slide. A couple of the highlights for what we're doing this year. We will be increasing transit service levels, the number of hours, gradually back to where we were prior to the pandemic. We'll be maintaining current staffing levels. There's no change proposed to the current fare structure, and the budget does continue to support VTA's strategic plan. Next slide, please. This one shows the service levels, which we measure in service miles and service hours. And in the first column, you can see where we were in fiscal year 2019, which is the last normal year that we had. The next column shows you what happened in the fiscal year 20, when this was at the beginning of the pandemic and the social distance requirements went into effect. We dramatically cut back our service hours and miles. And then the current year is fiscal year 2021. Our fiscal year started in July. So this started last July, it goes through this June. And this is where we project that we'll end up this year, which is that we've continued to decrease the service levels. Moving forward, the budget proposal shows that we would gradually get back to the same number of hours and miles that we had in 2019. And then by the following year in 2023, we would be operating essentially at the same number of hours that we had back in our last normal year. Next slide, please. Here's kind of a mirror. This is what's happened to our ridership. So if you look at column B, that was again the last normal year that we had. Then you can see what happened at the beginning of the pandemic in fiscal year 20. That's in column C. The year that we're in right now is column E, and you can see that we are about a third of less than a third where we used to be with our ridership. Even next year, when we hope that things will get back to some semblance of normalcy, we expect to see an increase in ridership, and that will continue through, as you see in column J, in fiscal year 2023. But we project that we will not be back to the same level of ridership we had even 2 years from now. Next slide, please. We've got a pie chart here that attempts to show where the revenue comes in for our VTA operating budget. And the thing that I want to point out here, there are 2 slivers there that are in red, and it's called other and fares. Everything else in this pie chart, which was just about 90%, almost 90% of all of our revenues, are related to sales taxes, and they're from different measures, but they all operate in the same direction, which is to say, when times are good, those numbers go up. Our budget is more flush. When times are not so good and sales taxes go down, they all go in the same direction. They start to go down, and sometimes they really plummet. So we've been lucky in the current year. It's not been as bad as we had thought, but we have seen a decline in sales tax revenue. Let's go to the next slide. So kind of the highlights of our sales tax revenue. We get them from actually 5 different sources, but they make up, as it says here, over 85, close to 90% of the operating revenues now. We lost about almost 12% of our local sales tax revenues between our last normal year and the following year. The proposed budget for the way we project the sales taxes, we have 2 different ways. For 3 of those 5 sources, we have our own consultants, and we are using conservative growth projections. Even though I say they're conservative, we're still projecting a pretty healthy increase for next year, almost 14% in next year and 6.5% the following year. But that is still reflecting a rather conservative outlook on the future for sales tax revenues. And then there are 2 of the sales tax revenue sources, TDA and STA, which we are using projections from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. The funds come through them, and so we're using their projections. Let's go on to the next slide, and we'll start to look at the expenses, how we propose to spend our resources. You'll see that the biggest chunk of this, 81%, is for service delivery, and I'm going to talk in the next slide what that's comprised of. We also have about 7% of our revenue, of our expenses go for contracted services, which is primarily for paratransit. We have some debt service. We have, if you'll see, there's a transfer to capital reserve, about 8%. And when Franklin gets into his part of the presentation, he'll show you where that money is projected to go. But we do take some of the money from our operating budget to capital for critical items that can't be funded anyplace else. Next slide, please. In this one, that slide there, you saw that over 80% of our money goes for service delivery, and I want to break that down a little bit. 73% of that, excuse me, if you can just, thanks. Almost 3/4 of it is for labor costs, and that's not a surprise because bus systems are very labor intensive. We have operators in every car. So we have most of our money is going for labor costs. We also have materials and supplies. Those are that range the whole gamut, things that you put on the buses, parts for the light rail vehicles. We also have security costs. We have costs for fuel, diesel fuel, and for traction power for the light rail vehicles. So you can see the largest component here is for the labor costs. So I do want to, on the next slide, we'll go to slide 12, and I'll tell you some of the assumptions that we have built into our labor costs for the next 2 years. First, very importantly, we have labor contracts with 4 different of our collective bargaining units with our 4 different unions. And we know what is in those contracts, so we build those into our budget projections, but they will all expire before the end of the year, calendar year 2022. So we've not built in any assumptions. We know that there will be increases, and we'll amend the budget after we finish with those contract negotiations. We also have pension and retiree health contributions, and we're using the latest available actuarial information. And then you can see the total number of budgeted positions we have here. It's essentially what we've had this year, but we are including 4 new janitor positions. So let's go on to slide 13. This shows you the revenues and expenses for 4 years. So let's look starting at the left-hand side. In 2020, you see that the revenues are on the left side there in green. So in that year, we had about 468 million, and the expenses are in blue on the right side. And the difference between them is that number at the top. So for fiscal year 20, our our expenses were higher than our revenues by about $5.4 million. And that trend carries forward into the next, the current year that we're in and the next 2 years, which is the budget cycle. So in the current year, we expect that our expenses will be about 35 million higher than our revenues. For next year, it'll be about 7 million higher. And then in the following year, about $14 million higher. And then let's go to the next slide, because here's where we start to look at trends over the long-term period. We're looking at a 10-year period. The line on the bottom, which is in blue, is our revenue trend, what we're expecting for our revenues. And then the red line is the expenses. And as you can see, expenses are projected to be higher than revenues in all years. On the left side, you can see the number that we're talking about for next year, close to $7 million as a negative balance. But by the time we get to fiscal year 31, that'll be about $47 million. So one thing that you could ask is, like, how are we able to operate like this? Well, for right now, we are able to do this because we have federal relief funding that's been approved by Congress. And at this point, we are projecting that those funds will last us a number of years, but they would be exhausted by 2028. And of course, that's just an estimate at this point. Let me go to the next slide, which is my last one, and then I'll let Franklin take over. We do have a number of risks. Always there are risks built into the budget. As I mentioned, we have not included the impact of upcoming labor negotiations, and that will add to our expenses. I talked a little bit about the sales tax revenues and the fact that they are volatile and they always go the same direction. But in addition, we know that if diesel fuel prices were to spike suddenly, that would add another increased cost that's not included in our projections. Same with utilities. There are times when those increase faster or greater than what we had projected. And the same is true for healthcare and pension costs. We have built in reasonable projected increases, but if they were to spike higher than what we have projected, that would put a burden on our operating budget. And then the last thing is the transit ridership. We are doing our best to estimate that, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the next 2 years, and that has an impact on our fare revenues going forward. So those are the kind of the highlights of the operating budget. I would like to turn it over to Franklin Wong, who's our deputy director with a long title, and he's going to talk about the capital side. And then I want to finish at the end with some of the discussion that came out of the workshop last week and what we are doing to follow up on comments from the board members.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good afternoon, everyone. So let's move on to the next slide. For this part of the presentation, first I'll go over the 4 major capital programs. Without further ado, next slide, please. In order for VTA to operate transit services, we do have a wide array of fixed assets and rolling stocks to provide, the means for us to operate public transit, ranging from bus stops, light rail stations, transit centers, to, of course, our light rail vehicles and bus fleet. And of course, also, with the technology and safety infrastructure that allow us to do so. In order to do that, we do have to provide funding to sustain these important infrastructure. Next slide, please. Hence, if you can go back one slide. Thank you. So this slide basically provide a summary of the 4 major capital program budgets. As Kathleen mentioned in her presentation, from our transit fund operating budget, we do set aside a share that contribute to our VTA Transit capital budget. As you can see here, we leverage that $75 million for other outside fund sources in order to augment our capital budget for the next 2 fiscal years. So I'll go over that in a little bit more detail later on. And then there are 2 local sales tax measures, 2000 Measure A and 2016 Measure B. The former, basically we leverage about just shy of 20% of that $2.1 billion appropriation request for the next 2 fiscal years for 2 major capital projects. And for 2016 Measure B, so far our board of directors have approved the formula-based program areas. They are reviewing the other part, which is the need capacity-based program areas. So the dollar amount there only show just a portion of the local sales tax measure for in terms of appropriation for the next 2 fiscal years. Last but not least is our Valley Transportation Plan, VTP Transportation Program, which I will go over in detail later on. Next slide, please. There are some assumptions that I'd like to quickly go over. The numbers that I just quickly review basically represent planned spending to be incurred or committed. And I want to emphasize that because by appropriating it doesn't mean that the expenses will be incurred in the next 2 fiscal years. Rather, it allows VTA to secure various kind of contracts, should they be construction or professional services or procurement contracts, that will allow us to pursue those important capital projects. And appropriations, once got approved, if the expenses are not incurred, they'll be carried forward and do not expire, which is a very important concept which distinguishes capital budgets from operating ones, in which you basically spend it or lose it within a 12-month fiscal year. And the VTA Transit Capital Program, which I will go over in a minute, is currently under review by the Capital Program Committee of VTA, and they could recommend for board approval later on. And the appropriation, if got approved by the board, the capital budgets that I am going to go through in a little bit more detail, they will be all appropriated in fiscal year 2022 to facilitate programs administration. Without further ado, let's go over the first major capital program. Next slide, please. And in front of us is the tabulation of the VTA Transit Fund capital budget. And the dollar amount there covers not just the contribution from VTA local funds, but also from other fund sources, which will provide funding of more than $200 million to more than 60 projects. Next slide, please. This is another way to look at this proposed capital budget by fund sources. As you can see, once again, the VTA local funding account for 1/3 of it, and we leverage that to solicit funding from federal, state, and other fund sources, with a little bit of help from the formula-based program areas of 2016 Measure B. Next slide, please. So now we move on to the next major capital program, which is funded by the 2000 Measure A program. Next slide. And there are 2 major extension projects that this this sales tax measure program will cover. BART extension to Silicon Valley Phase 2 and the East Ridge Light Rail extension. And as we tabulated here, about $400 million out of the $2.1 billion proposed appropriation come from the sales tax measure. The rest come from federal, state, and other sources, such as Regional Measure 3, which is pending, as well as the Local Carbon Transit Operations Program from the state. Next slide, please. To look at this, look at the 2 projects combined, these are the share of fund sources. Once again, 2000 Measure A only account for just shy of 1/5 of the proposed budget appropriation. So let's move on to the next major capital program. Next slide. Which is the 2016 Measure B program. As I mentioned, once again, the appropriation carries forward and do not expire. And so far, the board has review, and hopefully we'll go for the May board meeting for approval of the formula-based program areas. The program areas, which is considered to be capacity-based, will be reviewed by the board later on in 2021. So the dollar amount here, just shy of 172 million, is reflecting only the formula-based program areas portion. Next slide, please. The fourth major capital program, which I'll quickly review, is the VTP transportation program, covering the planning and completion of these four major project areas. Next slide, please. And these four major categories are being tabulated here in the requested appropriation dollar amounts and also the number of projects to hopefully receive funding from. And next slide, please. To look at it differently is how is this $400 million capital budget, where the fund sources come from. I want to emphasize that the slides for the 2016 Measure B is just a proposal at this time. It's pending further board review, and this could change. But right now, the game plan is to leverage that local sales tax measure to solicit other fund sources from state and from the other fund sources as tabulated on the right-hand side of this slide, ranging from State Senate Bill 1, county cities, and private entities, as well as finance. So with that said, let's move on to the other sales tax measure or other specific funds that are included in this biennial budget. So now we move on to other programs. Next slide, please. And let's move on to, yes, thank you. So for 2000 Measure A, not only we have a capital budget, but also we have an operating budget as well. And it's primarily for the operating assistance from this sales tax measure to the transit fund operating budget, and also to pay back for debt services. And the table below shows the proposed operating budget for the next 2 fiscal years under this fund. Next slide, please. Here's another program that VTA administers. As Kathleen mentioned, VTA is more than just a transit operator. We are also a congestion management agency, and we do collect assessments from local jurisdictions. And the small table below basically lists our proposed budget for the CMP, the Congestion Management Program, and is pending for the board's Congestion Management Program and Planning Committee for their review in May, pending hopefully recommendation for board approval. Next slide, please. The next program I want to quickly go over is our Transit-Oriented Development Program. It has its own fund and provide funding for operations, and also they have a small capital program to allow mixed income transit-oriented developments. Next slide, please. VTA is also responsible for administering and also construction of the Silicon Valley Express lanes. So the operating budget here, as tabulated, is mostly for the day-to-day operations of toll collection and other maintenance activities. Next slide, please. The last program that I want to go over today is the 2008 Measure B, which support the BART extension to the Silicon Valley. Right now, we have the 10-mile extension open with 2 stations at Milpitas and Berryessa. So the proposed budget here will provide funding to the operations and maintenance costs to BART, as well as VTA's contribution to the capital improvement projects per the agreement between the 2 agencies, as well as some related operating expenses incurred by VTA. Next slide, please. So Kathleen and myself have quickly go over, the 8 separate fund sources with the operating and capital budgets are requested. It is being summarized in this table. And you can find this table also in our proposed budget book, which is published in our web, which is available on our website as well. Next slide, please. We are now, of course, going through our first community meeting. There will be a second one scheduled for next Tuesday at 6 p.m., which is also going to be a virtual public meeting. Next slide, please. And in front of us is a schedule of standing advisory committee meetings that the budget will be reviewed and commented, and then it will reach to the June 3rd board meeting, hopefully for the board's adoption. So I guess, at this point, I will pass it back to Kathleen for her closing comments.
Thank you, Franklin. I wanted to follow up on really the main discussion that came out of the board workshop last week. There were a lot of comments and concerns about the number of pass-ups that we're enduring right now, where buses are going by and not able to pick people up. The main reason for that, of course, is the social distancing. We are currently operating about 80% of the service hours that we used to operate, but because of social distancing, we only have 10 to 20% of the capacity that we used to have. Even though we added more service in February of this year, we still are not able to keep up with the number of people. When it's safe to relax the social distancing restrictions, that will bring really immediate relief. But until then, the only remedy that we have is to try to put out more service so that we can pick up more people on those high frequency routes. Although we're right now using a fair amount of overtime with operators to be able to do that, we're obviously not been keeping up. At the board meeting, at the workshop, the board members challenged us to go back and to work with our partners in the union to see what else we might be able to do. So in the days since then, we've already started that process. We're really looking at 3 areas. One is on overtime, what we can do to incentivize more people to use overtime to be able to put out more service. We're also looking at potential changes we could make with our schedules and how frequently we change the schedules so that we could try to better keep up. And then finally, what we can do on the side of recruiting and training our operators. We are doing that now, again, under the social distancing restrictions, but we are looking at how we can increase that, all with the goal of being able to add more service until we get the relief on the social distancing requirements and be able to put more service out there. So at this point, I don't have tangible solutions, but I can tell you that we are already meeting with the union. We're meeting internally, and we're looking at things that perhaps have been restrictions in the past that have kept us from doing things different. How we're looking now how we could do things differently, and that will be part of what we get back to the board with at our next meeting with them. So with that, I think we're ready to take questions, comments. Thank you, Karen.
I don't see any hands raised, so we'll just go down the list of questions in the Q&A box. I'll get to you in just a second, Marcia. I see your hand. I have a question from Roland. What is the source of the funding for Measure A debt service in fiscal year 2022 and 2023?
Karen, if I may, the debt service for 2000 Measure A comes from the sales tax measure itself, as I have mentioned in the presentation. Those fund sources come from the sales tax measure and is part of our 2000 Measure A fund operating budget.
question from Robin, slide 14. Why do you expect expenses and revenues in 2027 to drop below 2026 levels?
I could take a step on it, Karen. It's because there's some repayment obligations that 2000 Measure A have, in which that there's so far in the current budget cycle and through fiscal year 26, there those repayment obligations, there will be a transfer from 2000 Measure A to our transfer fund capital budget, and after that time point, all of those financing obligations will be fulfilled. So that will be for repayment obligations beyond that time frame, they will no longer be required. That's why for that revenue element in the transit fund budget, it will be zero from that point on. So also, as the graph may illustrate, there's a corresponding drop as well for the debt service side for the transit fund capital budget, because we have fewer refinancing obligations that we need to honor.
Okay, thank you. Question from Eugene. How much does VTA currently owe in unfunded pension liabilities?
We do have that published in the annual financial report. The last update that we have was as of June 30th, 2020. I don't have that report with me handy at this point, but we're more than happy to provide the exact numbers as reported in our annual financial report as a response later on.
Okay, we can follow up with Eugene on that. Okay, Robin has several questions. I'm going to skip to someone we haven't heard from yet. Question from Kevin. How much uncertainty is there behind sales tax projections? What's the likely range of revenue?
So I would say there's more uncertainty on the sales tax revenues right now than there usually is. The sales tax is always, the projections are projections, but we've not been in this situation before where we are coming out of a pandemic and everybody's kind of estimating on that. So range-wise, I don't remember, Franklin might remember the difference between when our consultants gave us optimistic and conservative, not pessimistic, but conservative projections. But the reason that we chose to go with the conservative ones is because of the greater unknowns than usual. So I think that the uncertainty, for the most part, is on the upside, meaning that if we are wrong, it's likely to be that we have underestimated, although I don't think we can count on underestimating significantly.
If I may, Kathleen, I want to also emphasize that, since the pandemic started, we have seen fluctuations from quarter to quarter when we try to compare that with the same quarter last calendar year. And we have seen it for the 3 complete quarters of calendar year 2020. We have a range of decrease, compared to the same time last year, ranging from almost 20% at the beginning of the pandemic to the summer of less than 10, and then by October to December, the gap, increase again. The gap grows. The drop actually accelerated, probably due to the spike of the pandemic late in 2020. So right now we are still waiting for the actual results from the state CDTFA in terms of local sales tax revenue. We won't know the final answer for the January to March quarter until late May. So at this point, we are still not sure whether we are truly solid in an upward trend. In other words, we still have a gap to catch up, even just to the last fiscal year, kind of like 12 months ago.
Okay, we're going to take a verbal question. Richard, there we go. Go ahead and unmute and speak when you're ready.
Thank you. Hi, this is Richard Marcantonio. I'm with Public Advocates. Thank you for bringing this follow-up to the board workshop. I have a comment and a question. And the comment is, first of all, about the forecasts. You've presented very precise forecasts of dollar amounts going out 10 years. And you've also acknowledged that the assumptions behind those forecasts are anybody's guess. And I appreciate that you're constantly like checking, month by month, quarter by quarter, how did we do against those forecasts. But consistently, I think it's fair to say during the pandemic, those forecasts have been overly conservative. There's no way of projecting ridership unless you're going to project it based on a commitment to increasing service early on. I think that's the main deciding factor about whether ridership is going to come back, is how soon you restore that service. Forecasts are a statistical range, and you've given one point in that. They're based on uncertain assumptions, and you haven't really disclosed what those are. So I think it would be useful if you could provide all of that in writing to the public. But it's not the time to go conservative. And just to wrap up, last time there were questions about the American Rescue Plan Act money. And the answer, as I recall, at the board workshop was that staff didn't yet know what was going on with that money. Questions are, have you since determined what money is going to be available for the new fiscal year? And second, will you prepare a budget scenario that includes ARP Act money? Thank you.
First, on the 10-year projections, in addition to what we presented here, there is a budget booklet that I believe is available on our website. And under the 10-year projections, which is on page 18 and 19 of that, we lay out in more detail the assumptions that are included. And while I think that the next 2 years, the revenues scenarios, our assumptions are certainly harder to try and figure out than in the past. Beyond that, we're projecting that revenues continue to increase at about the pace that they have been generally before the pandemic. So it never means that the past is prolonged. It could always be different. I share your concern about the conservative nature. Is that there's a downside to being wrong if you estimate too high, but there's a downside to being wrong if you estimate too low. And so we are aware of that, and I think that we, and especially the consultants, have learned a lot from the projections that they did last year, which you're right, were very much too conservative. But I think that looking into next year and saying it's conservative, but we still expect a 13% increase, there are some people who are concerned that even though we say it's conservative, it could go the other way. To get to your question about the latest money from the federal government, no, we don't have any more information on that, and it's we are not going to have more information on that based on our understanding from staff at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission prior to the time that this budget gets updated. So it probably will not be reflected in there, but would be available beyond these years. And I do want to say that the issue on, I agree with you on the issue on the service, having service available to people when they start riding again. We're all, I think, not just VTA, but all the transit operators are aware that if we're not able to meet people when they first come back, and they go to look for other alternatives, we may lose them permanently. So it's a real concern. And it's not, we are not holding back from a financial standpoint at this point, trying to figure out how we can accommodate the people as they come back. As I said before, we would have almost immediate relief once it's safe to open up and relax the social distancing. Up until then, we are looking at the resources we have and can bring to bear, and it's not a question of money. We'll spend the money that we need to do to make that available. But we do have a finite workforce in the short term, and so we're looking at how we can best use that.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Next question is from Marcia. Why is paratransit ridership missing from the ridership slide? Why do we only see light rail and bus?
So we do keep track of paratransit. Oh, go ahead, Franklin.
Yeah, and as Kathleen said, we do keep track of paratransit ridership, and it's actually the paratransit operating matrix and also the paratransit budget proposed being published in the proposed budget book. And I'll refer the individual to review it on page, I should remember it by heart, sorry.
It's page 13. Page 13 has the paratransit ridership and the hours. So
Thank you, Kathleen.
We just keep track of the costs for paratransit and the ridership for paratransit separate from the costs and the ridership for the fixed route service. But they are both included in the budget.
Okay, let's go back up. Question from Robin. Slide 21, could the VTA local funding for the VTA Transit capital projects be used to cover the operations deficit instead?
The answer is yes, it could, but it's mainly going to the kinds of projects that we need local funding on, so that we can keep up with the state of good repair, things that if we don't do on the capital side, they'll end up coming back as additional costs on the operating side. But also, as I said, especially right now in the short term with the federal funds available for helping with the deficits, the loss in revenue, it's not an immediate problem for us to shift that funding. Longer term, we do have to, of course, operate service, including what we transfer to capital, that can be equal to the revenues that we have available to us.
Okay, back to Roland. What is the source of funding for the $17 million for TOD development?
If I may, the TOD program has its own fund, which is independent, and so basically both the operating and capital budget comes from a specific transit-oriented development fund, which is separate from transit and other funds.
And so the revenues, and there's a little bit more about that on page 61, but the revenues are from leases that we have from VTA sites. So it's the revenue that comes in then from those leases can then fund other development.
Okay, Richard has another question. Will we prepare a budget scenario that includes ARP Act funds?
We won't be doing that now as part of the budget. After that is approved, the budget could be amended. We will be doing budget amendments, for instance, after the labor contracts are approved and we know what those increases are on the expense side. So it could change since this would be a change on the revenue side, there could be a budget amendment done at that time.
Okay, Kevin had kind of a two-part question. Let me go back and find. Let's see. He wants to know, Kevin wants to know about the future, like 10 years out, operations deficit, and if we have a strategy of how to cover that when it becomes an issue, say 10 years from now.
The answer is that we will have a strategy by then. It is a concern, obviously, when you look out and you see long term, there's a trend that's going the wrong direction. And when VTA did prepare the biennial budget 2 years ago, we did not have that problem. At the time, we had service that was in line with long-term revenues. What changed was our revenue stream dropped because of the pandemic. And even though it's going to go up from here, it's never going to catch up to what we had thought 2 years ago. So while our expense picture stayed about the same as we had projected 2 years ago, the revenue numbers came in lower. And so that trend is lower. So I think that the answer is that we will see over the next 2 years how things go. If revenues pick up much faster than we had thought and they get back to a level more quickly than we now expect to where we were before, and they can cover those, then everything could be fine. If not, we will have to look at the expense side, and what we do is we do service, and so we would have to look at the service side. We would look at contributions to capital. We would look at everything on the expense side to see what we have to bring down. The reason that we are not more concerned than we are right now is because we do have this cushion from the federal money for a couple of years, which, as it's intended to do, gives us some time to see where things are going with the economy in the long term. If we had these numbers and we had no federal funding to rely on to help us bridge the gap, we would have to be making some serious changes right now. But we have the luxury of a couple of years, and obviously we hope that by the time we come back in 2 years, the revenue picture has indeed changed enough that those numbers are more manageable. And at some point we get back to knowing that we can operate the service we have with the revenues that we have on our own, not relying on federal funding.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Question from Monica: is VTA trying to get MTC to release the ARP funds sooner? Will ridership impact the ability to get those funds?
At this point, I don't think there's anything that can be done to get them to release them sooner. They've been meeting regularly with transit operators. There are some transit operators, unfortunately, who are in much worse shape than VTA, even for next year. They need to know more about those numbers. So they've moved the schedule as fast as they can, but they don't think they can go any faster. Will ridership play into it? They are definitely going to ask for information from all the transit operators, and they are planning to have a workshop with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission Board in June, at which time all of the major transit operators would be invited to have their general manager come in and talk about what's happening. They'll be looking at what the ridership was like before the pandemic, in terms of demographics, and They'll be looking at what's happened during the pandemic to ridership, where people have issues like pass-ups, and again, unfortunately, we are not the ones probably with the worst situation as far as pass-ups. Places like Muni have really very, very high numbers. But they are going to be looking at all of those issues, and they are also going to be looking at operators' ability to match their service levels to their revenues after the federal funding goes away. So in other words, they are going to want people to have a plan for making sure that they have sustainable service. And as I mentioned, right now we have that gap. It's not huge, but it is a gap. But there are also other operators with much larger gaps in their projected revenues and expenses.
Okay, I'll do one final question for folks who don't get a response in this meeting for your question. Feel free to send an email to community.outreach@vta.org with your question, and we will send you a response as soon as we can. So last question. Something we haven't covered yet. Page 24 and 25 in the booklet seems to suggest that VTA plans to spend more on IT than on passenger facilities. Is that correct? He's looking at line items 42 to 51 for IT and line items 38 to 41 for passenger facilities.
What I would say in general is that, and I'm trying to look at what's in here. I believe this is the VTA Transit plan. Is that right, Franklin?
Correct. And I want to also, point out that we actually classify facilities in more than one category. So for passenger facilities, there's a collection of 4 projects, but further up from the list, in the list, there are also operating facilities and equipment, as well as light railway power and stick. Even though passengers will not touch those equipment or facilities, those are the essential parts of a viable transit system. So such as, light rail signals, rail replacement, and also, yard pavement, and also expanding the our bus yard for electric buses. So those are just some examples, in that list that allow VTA to continue to provide state-of-the-art repair for our facilities, and also allow us to be more environmental friendly.
And the other thing I want to say about the money that we use from the VTA budget, a lot of times what we are using our capital money on is projects for which we can't get external funding. So actually most of the capital money that comes into our system is not from our own VTA fund. It's federal, and it's state, and it's other kinds of funding. Some of the big projects that don't compete very well for that kind of funding, unfortunately, are IT projects. And so that's why the money from the VTA fund often goes into those. Things that are more related to passengers, to facilities, to vehicles, that's where we get a lot of our federal and state money. And so what you're looking at here is really a small sliver of the total capital funding. And that's one of the reasons that you see more of a significance on the IT projects. Whereas if you look at our entire capital budget, that those things just don't compete well for a lot of the outside funding.
Okay, we've come up to 1 o'clock. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and for having such great in-depth questions. And again, we can continue the conversation via email, community.outreach@vta.org. And we also have another identical meeting to this coming up on Tuesday, the 27th at 6 p.m. So you're welcome to come back then and hear the same presentation again and rejoin a similar question and answer session. And again, we did have some trouble with the YouTube live. I apologize for that. We've had a slew of technical computer issues at VTA this week, but the meeting today has been recorded and I will post it to the YouTube channel as soon as I am able. So you can watch it again there. There's also already posted on our YouTube channel the board workshop version of this meeting from last Friday. So you can see the slides again and hear different Q&A from the public that attended that meeting last Friday. So with that, I will end the meeting and thank you all for coming.